A lonely farmhouse sits on the edge of town. People ride past every day without looking. Everyone believes the widow wants to be left alone. One afternoon, a cowboy carrying groceries stops at her gate. He walks to the porch and knocks. A weak voice answers, "Please, just go." Instead, he gently leaves the basket, and says, "I'll come back tomorrow." The next morning, he came back and saw something unexpected. There was a time when Eleanor Harper's home was the warmest place in Willow Creek. Every afternoon, the comforting aroma of fresh bread drifted through her open windows, a pot of coffee simmered gently on the stove, and the front porch was rarely empty. Children gathered after school to hear one of her stories before running home with warm biscuits wrapped in cloth. Neighbors stopped by without invitation because they knew they would always be welcomed with kindness. As the town's beloved schoolteacher and gifted seamstress, Eleanor had spent decades mending not only torn clothes but also broken spirits. She knew every family's story, remembered every child's birthday, and somehow always found enough food for anyone who arrived at her door hungry. Then, one quiet autumn evening, her husband Samuel passed away. His death didn't change the town overnight. It happened slowly, almost too quietly to notice. Eleanor stopped opening her curtains each morning. She missed a Sunday at church, then another. The laughter that once filled her little farmhouse disappeared, replaced by an aching silence that settled into every room. At first, neighbors came by to offer condolences, bringing casseroles and warm embraces. But as weeks turned into months, the visits became fewer. People assumed she needed space. They convinced themselves they were respecting her wishes. Before long, no one knocked anymore. It wasn't that the town had stopped caring. They had simply grown comfortable believing she wanted to be alone. On the other side of Willow Creek lived Caleb Morgan, a widowed ranch owner whose own heart still carried the weight of loss. Years earlier, he had buried his wife after a long illness, and ever since, he had learned that grief had a cruel way of making a crowded world feel painfully empty. Caleb wasn't a man who offered grand speeches or dramatic gestures. He believed compassion lived in quiet actions, a repaired fence, a helping hand, or simply showing up when everyone else had stopped trying. One crisp morning, Caleb rode into town to purchase supplies for the ranch. As Mrs. Ellis gathered flour, coffee, and canned goods behind the counter of the general store, his eyes wandered across the customer ledger lying open nearby. Familiar names filled every page, each marked with recent purchases. But one name was missing. "Eleanor Harper hasn't been in lately?" Caleb asked. Mrs. Ellis looked up with a tired sigh. "Not for a long while." "Somebody taking groceries out to her?" She paused, then shrugged. "I suppose someone must be." But neither of them sounded convinced. The question lingered in Caleb's mind long after he left the store. Instead of riding straight home, he stopped at the bakery and bought a warm loaf of bread, a small jar of blackberry preserves, fresh vegetables, and a little honey. He arranged everything carefully inside a woven basket before turning his horse toward the lonely farmhouse standing just beyond the edge of town. When he reached the porch, he removed his hat and knocked gently. For several moments, there was only silence. Finally, the door opened just enough for Eleanor to look through the narrow gap. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, but the weariness in her eyes revealed the loneliness she had carried for far too long. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. "My name's Caleb Morgan," he replied with a gentle smile. "I figured everyone could use fresh bread." Her eyes dropped to the basket before quickly lifting again. "I appreciate it," she said softly, "but I don't have anything to give you in return." Caleb shook his head. "I wasn't asking for anything. I don't take charity." "This isn't charity," he answered. "It's just bread." For a long moment she hesitated. Pride battled quietly with hunger. At last, she accepted the basket with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb simply tipped his hat. "You have yourself a peaceful evening, Miss Harper." He climbed back onto his horse and rode away without another word. That night, Eleanor carefully sliced the warm bread and spread a thin layer of honey across it. It was the first meal she'd truly enjoyed in weeks. She folded the cloth wrapping with remarkable care before placing it beside the empty basket, as though preserving a kindness she wasn't ready to forget. The following afternoon, Caleb returned. The basket sat neatly on the porch. Inside rested a single folded note. Written in careful handwriting were only two simple words. "Thank you." Caleb smiled quietly before placing the basket back beneath his arm. As he turned his horse toward the ranch, something caught his attention. A thin ribbon of gray smoke curled gently from the farmhouse chimney, rising into the cool afternoon sky. He slowed his horse and looked back one last time, or the first time in months. Someone was cooking. The days that followed settled into a quiet routine neither of them ever spoke about. Every few mornings, Caleb would ride out to Eleanor's little farmhouse with something useful tucked into his saddlebag. Sometimes it was fresh vegetables from his garden. Other times it was flour, coffee, or a few eggs gathered before sunrise. If he noticed a loose fence post leaning in the wind, he stopped to straighten it. When a storm pulled shingles from the roof, he climbed the ladder and repaired them before the next rain arrived. As the weather grew colder, he stacked fresh firewood neatly beside the porch without waiting to be asked. He never knocked expecting an invitation, never lingered longer than necessary, and never asked the questions everyone else probably would have. He simply helped, tipped his hat, and rode away. At first, Eleanor watched him through the lace curtains, saying little more than a polite "thank you." But little by little, the door began opening wider. Their conversation stretched from a few words into several quiet minutes. One chilly afternoon, as Caleb prepared to leave after replacing a broken porch rail, Eleanor surprised even herself. "Would you care for a cup of tea?" she asked almost hesitantly. Caleb smiled warmly. "I'd like that." It wasn't a grand moment, but inside that small farmhouse, over 2 steaming cups of tea, the silence no longer felt lonely. They spoke about the changing weather, the harvest, and the old cottonwood tree that had stood in the yard longer than either of them could remember. Neither mentioned grief. Neither needed to. Some people recognize pain without ever giving it a name. Before long, the town began noticing Caleb's frequent rides toward the widow's house. Outside the general store, a ranch hand shook his head with a chuckle. "Why do you keep going back?" he asked. "Seems like she's made up her mind to be alone." Caleb calmly tightened his saddle before answering. "Maybe she didn't choose to be alone." The man frowned. "Then why is she?" Caleb looked toward the distant farmhouse before quietly replying, "Because everyone else stopped showing up." Those words lingered long after the conversation ended. Not long afterward, a curious little girl named Annie asked if she could ride along with Caleb one afternoon. Eleanor greeted the child with gentle surprise, and before the visit was over, Annie was sitting beside her with a needle and thread in her tiny hands. Eleanor patiently showed her how to mend a torn piece of cloth, then read a few pages from an old storybook resting on the shelf. The lessons weren't only about sewing or reading. They were about patience, kindness, and taking care of people without expecting anything in return. For the first time in years, laughter drifted through the old farmhouse windows. During one of his visits, Caleb noticed something that stirred his curiosity. Resting neatly inside a wooden cabinet were dozens of carefully addressed envelopes, each covered in a thin layer of dust. Some were tied together with faded ribbon. None had ever been opened. None had ever been mailed. He wondered who they were meant for and what words they carried, but he never asked. If Eleanor wished to tell him, she would do so in her own time. As the afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon, Caleb stepped onto the porch and reached for his hat. Just before he climbed onto his horse, Eleanor spoke so softly he almost didn't hear her. "Caleb." He turned. With tears quietly gathering in her eyes, she offered a fragile smile. You're the first visitor I've had in nearly 2 years. Those simple words stayed with him all the way home. As Caleb's visits became more frequent, he began seeing pieces of Eleanor's life that had remained hidden behind years of silence. One afternoon, while Annie searched a bookshelf for another story to read, Caleb's eyes wandered across a collection of worn journals stacked neatly on a wooden table. Beside them lay faded lesson plans, old report cards, handwritten recipes, and dozens of carefully tied letters that had never been sent. Curious, he picked up one of the journals and discovered page after page filled not only with classroom lessons, but with encouragement for struggling children, recipes passed down through generations, and quiet reminders that kindness was often life's greatest education. It was then he realized Eleanor had once taught nearly every child in Willow Creek and the surrounding counties. The town's doctor had sat in her classroom. So had the sheriff, local farmers, merchants, and even Pastor Thomas. Without seeking recognition, she had shaped the lives of countless people who had long since forgotten the woman who first believed in them. Later that afternoon, Annie looked up from her sewing with innocent curiosity. "Miss Eleanor, why did you stop teaching?" The room fell still. Eleanor lowered her eyes and gently folded the fabric in her lap before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. "Because I thought no one needed me anymore." No one spoke after that. Even the ticking clock on the mantel seemed louder than before. Those words stayed with Caleb long after he rode away. Over the next several days, he quietly sought out people who had once been Eleanor's students. One by one, they smiled at the mention of her name. Some laughed as they remembered the stories she read aloud. Others grew unexpectedly emotional. One middle-aged rancher wiped away tears before saying, "Everything good in my life started in her classroom." Caleb said very little. He simply listened, knowing exactly what he had to do next. Then, early on Sunday morning, a knock echoed across Eleanor's quiet porch. She slowly opened the door, surprised to find one familiar face standing there. Before she could speak, another knock came from behind him, then another, and another. Soon, the porch that had stood empty for years was filled with people who had finally remembered the woman who had never forgotten them. Sunday morning no longer belonged to silence. The first knock on Eleanor's door had barely faded when another followed, then another, until the quiet farmhouse echoed with voices it hadn't heard in years. She slowly opened the door, expecting perhaps Caleb or little Annie. Instead, standing on her porch was a middle-aged man holding a fresh loaf of bread wrapped in a clean white cloth. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the stranger smiled through misty eyes and quietly said, "Miss Harper. I don't know if you remember me. I'm Daniel Brooks. You taught me to read when I was 7. Before Eleanor could gather her thoughts, another wagon pulled into the yard. Then another. Horses lined the old fence one after another as men, women, and even children stepped down carrying flowers, homemade pies, baskets of vegetables, faded photographs, and carefully preserved letters. Some had traveled from neighboring towns after hearing Caleb had found the woman who had once changed their lives. Others had simply realized it had been far too long since they'd said thank you. The little farmhouse that had stood forgotten for years suddenly became the busiest place in Willow Creek. One elderly woman embraced Eleanor so tightly that neither wanted to let go. "You stayed after school every afternoon until I learned to write my own name," she whispered. "I've wanted to thank you ever since." A local doctor placed an old photograph into Eleanor's hands. It showed a classroom filled with smiling children, and there she was in the center, younger but wearing the same gentle smile. "You told me I could become anything if I kept learning," he said. "Every patient I've ever helped started because you believed in a frightened little boy." Another former student stepped forward, his voice trembling with emotion. "You were the first person who ever told me I wasn't a failure." Then he wrapped his arms around her. "I've waited 20 years to thank you." By now, tears were flowing freely down Eleanor's cheeks. Not tears of sorrow, but of disbelief. She looked from one familiar face to another, realizing that the children she had once taught had become parents, business owners, ranchers, teachers, and leaders. They hadn't forgotten the lessons she'd given them. They had simply forgotten to come back. Even the townspeople who had never been her students stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, watching something extraordinary unfold. For years they had convinced themselves Eleanor preferred solitude. Standing there now, they could finally see the truth. She hadn't pushed the town away. The town had slowly drifted away from her. Among those standing in silence was Sheriff Wallace. Removing his hat, he stared at the weathered porch with visible regret before speaking quietly enough that only those nearby could hear. "I've ridden past this house every week for nearly 3 years." He swallowed hard. "I never stopped." No one judged him. Because in that moment, everyone realized they had done exactly the same thing. As the afternoon faded into evening, the visitors slowly returned home, leaving behind flowers on the porch, fresh food in the pantry, and a warmth that had not lived inside the old farmhouse for many years. The laughter gradually disappeared down the dusty road until only Caleb remained, helping Eleanor gather the empty baskets left behind by grateful former students. The porch grew quiet once again, but this silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the peaceful stillness that follows a heart finally beginning to heal. Eleanor looked out across the yard where wagon tracks crisscrossed the grass, evidence that people had come back after all. Then she turned toward Caleb, her eyes still glistening in the fading light. With a soft, almost disbelieving smile, she whispered, "I thought everyone had forgotten me." Caleb looked at her for a long moment before answering. "They never forgot who you were, Eleanor. They just forgot to come home." Winter settled over Willow Creek with quiet determination, covering the fields in a blanket of white and filling the mornings with crisp air and wood smoke. But unlike the winters Eleanor had endured alone, this one felt different. Before the first heavy snowfall, someone arrived to chop and stack firewood beside her porch without waiting to be asked. The next day, Mrs. Ellis left a basket filled with soup, fresh bread, and preserves at her doorstep. A neighboring rancher repaired the gate that had refused to close properly for years. Children stopped by after school carrying books, eager to hear one of Miss Eleanor's stories before hurrying home. The old farmhouse, once silent enough to hear only the wind through the trees, had become alive again. Laughter drifted through its windows, warm meals filled the kitchen, and for the first time in years, the front porch welcomed visitors almost every afternoon. One snowy evening, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the hills, Caleb sat beside Eleanor on the porch, each holding a warm cup of tea. They watched the snowflakes settle quietly across the empty road, neither of them feeling the need to fill the silence. After a long moment, Eleanor turned toward him, her voice gentle but filled with curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb smiled. "Of course." She looked down at her hands before speaking. "Why did you knock on my door that first day, when everyone else had stopped?" Caleb's expression softened. He stared toward the horizon for a moment before answering. "Because a long time ago, after I lost my wife, someone knocked on mine." He paused, remembering. They didn't have the right words. They didn't try to fix my grief. They just sat with me until I remembered I wasn't facing it alone. Eleanor quietly brushed away the tears gathering in her eyes. "You didn't save my life, Caleb," she whispered. He looked at her. She smiled through her tears. "You reminded everyone that I still had one." For the first time since losing her husband, Eleanor laughed. It wasn't because the sorrow had disappeared. Some losses never truly leave us. But grief no longer had the final word. She wasn't carrying it alone anymore, and somehow, that made all the difference. Just then, the front gate creaked open, and little Annie came running through the snow, carefully protecting something beneath her coat. Breathless with excitement, she climbed the porch steps and placed a brand-new leather-bound notebook into Eleanor's hands. "I got this for you," Annie said with a hopeful smile. Eleanor gently opened the first blank page, then looked back at the little girl. Annie's eyes sparkled as she asked the question that would change everything. "Will you teach us again?" Months quietly slipped by, and with each passing season, the old farmhouse seemed to breathe a little more life back into Willow Creek. The porch that had once gathered nothing but dust and fallen leaves was now rarely empty. Every Saturday morning, children arrived carrying notebooks tucked beneath their arms, eager to hear Miss Eleanor's stories once again. She taught them how to read with confidence, how to mend torn clothes with patience, and how to treat people with kindness long before judging them. Between lessons, she shared the recipes her mother had once written down during difficult years, reminding them that a simple loaf of bread could carry hope just as surely as it carried nourishment. Parents often lingered nearby, smiling as they watched their children learn from the woman who had once taught them the very same lessons. Former students continued returning whenever they could. Some traveled from neighboring towns just to spend an afternoon on her porch. Others came with their own children, proudly introducing them to the teacher who had first believed in them. The lonely farmhouse that had once stood forgotten at the edge of town slowly became the heart of the community again. There was always a kettle warming on the stove, fresh bread cooling on the windowsill, and another chair waiting for whoever happened to stop by. Eleanor no longer counted the quiet days because there were so few of them left. One peaceful evening, as the prairie sky turned shades of gold and crimson, Caleb rode slowly up the familiar path carrying a warm loaf of bread wrapped inside a clean white cloth. Before he could climb the porch steps or raise his hand to knock, the front door swung open. Eleanor stood there smiling. "You don't have to knock anymore," she said warmly. "Your family." Caleb laughed softly, handing her the fresh bread before joining her on the porch. Together they settled into the old rocking chairs, watching the sun sink behind the rolling hills. Children's laughter drifted across the yard as Annie and her friends played beneath the cottonwood trees. Neighbors passing along the road tipped their hats and waved without slowing, no longer passing a forgotten house but greeting a place that once again felt like home. For a while, neither Caleb nor Eleanor said a word. They simply watched the evening settle over the valley, grateful for the quiet that no longer felt empty. Perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. Not that one lonely widow had been rescued. Not that an entire town had suddenly changed overnight. But that one man had chosen to stop where everyone else kept riding. And in doing so, he reminded an entire community of the woman they should never have forgotten. Because sometimes, the greatest act of kindness isn't changing someone's life overnight. Sometimes, it's simply refusing to walk past the door that everyone else stopped knocking on.